Thank you to Gary Hart. And now I invite to speak against the motion Christopher Hitchens, who's a writer, broadcaster and columnist. He emigrated to the United States in 1981. For the past 12 years, he's been columnist and contributing editor at Vanity Fair and has reported, I believe, from something like 60 countries on 5 different continents. His books include studies of the Kurds, the UN, the Palestine question, Clinton, Kissinger, and his most recent is A Long Short War, the Postponed Liberation of Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, can I go as far as brothers and sisters? Good. Comrades and friends? Okay. I apologize for speaking to you through a wad of inflammation from my recent adventures in American dentistry. I don't want to sound more than usually as if I have a plum lodged in my mouth, but I don't want you to mistake my vulnerability for weakness. Many of you will know how terrible it can be to be savaged by a hamster. I also want to say what a distinction it is to appear not just with Comrade Aronovich, with whose father I was at Balliol College when Sam Aronovich, a very celebrated old fighter, was a mature student there, but with Simon Jenkins, who's been lending tone to my profession since I was the merest cub in it, and with Senator Hart, who I remember very well from my earliest days in Washington. He has, among other things, he's too modest to say it, the distinction of having got Senator Patrick Moynihan of New York to vote for the one and only time that he ever did against a defense appropriation, namely the MX missile. It was, I think I'm correct in saying, on the motion of Senator Hart that this missile was condemned on the grounds that, since it was designed to destroy already hardened and cemented and buried missile bunkers, it presumably would not be launched when those bunkers were already empty. That would be, as it were, a waste of energy. Preemptive it might have been, but aggressive would also cover it. It was a very dangerous and destabilizing weapon, and I remember that debate and the honorable contribution made by the Senator very vividly. And I remember the way, indeed, in which that the idea, originally very intensely American, well, you get your retaliation in first, helped to degenerate the idea of deterrence and degenerate it further into effectively a policy of use them or lose them. And this was the point at which we had degenerated when the Cold War fortunately ended and a certain amount of sanity supervened, but we're in the debt of those who kept their heads before that sanity kicked in. Now, I mentioned therefore that obviously for a reason. And I'm not the only person to have read the Senator's study of threats to Homeland Security with a wince at the warnings that were overlooked and ignored. But what if I put the case, as Mr. Jaggers used to say, what if I put the case? What if the warnings hadn't been overlooked and ignored? In early 2001 in Afghanistan, the following occurred. The ancient statues of Bamiyan, the two twin, not quite twin, but matching Buddhas, testimony to the time of the Hellenic influence, even of Alexander himself, and the fusion of Buddhism in the ancient civilizations of Afghanistan, were destroyed by heavy artillery by the Taliban as the result of an argument within their own ranks, which we know was carried in the direction of vandalism and cultural obliteration by the influence of the Al-Qaeda guests who they were sheltering. It was a warning. I'll put this briefly. That was a warning, ladies and gentlemen. Those weren't the only two twin structure objects they had in mind, but you could tell a lot from what they were doing there. And they gave ample warning of their intention to desecrate and destroy Afghan civilization and culture. And I think there was more of a warning than that in it. At the time, the Taliban was not recognized as the government of Afghanistan, except by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and the United Arab Emirates, I'm sad to say for them. It was not recognized as the legitimate government. It wasn't recognized by the UN. It wasn't in control of the country. It hadn't demonstrated sovereignty, let alone legitimacy. UNESCO had for a long time declared that property to be common property, the common property of humanity, the common cultural holding of our luckless species. What would have been wrong with dropping in a small force to say, on the day that dawned, whether these structures were to be shelled, obliterated, destroyed, no, you don't. We're standing between you and them. You don't have the right to do this. And by the way, we know what you're up to. I submit that that would have been an admirable thing in every respect. It would have incrementally, at least, but I think in the sense of principle as well, beefed up the fragile sense, the one that we're all so aware of not having now, of an international community that knows what it's talking about and doesn't, in the old phrase, stand idly by. I'll give this example just to let it settle in. It's often assumed, I think, that the concept of preemption, even prevention, runs counter, is promiscuous, unilateralist, runs counter to the nexus of international law and of institutions, indeed, that have been so painstakingly knit together since 1945, since the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its inscription in the Charter of the United Nations. Actually, that's not as true as many people think. The Genocide Convention, for example, to which this government is a signatory, as is the government of the United States, and many others, mandates signatory powers, upon receiving information that an attempt to exterminate in whole or in part a national or ethnic group is underway, mandates, and I repeat, to take action, either to prevent or, depending on how bad things have been allowed to get, to punish or to try and undo such a process. You have every right as a state not to sign the Genocide Convention. Having signed it, however, you are committed to taking action which unfortunately will be determined for you by genocideurs, by people who want to commit genocide, and you'd better be ready. And you'd better be ready actually to preempt them. I won't waste your time by pointing out also that the UN Charter contains automatic, axiomatic clauses about self-defense, which allow all nations to judge this to be in their own interests, but as the senators pointed out, this is something nations are as likely to take advantage of as otherwise. There are also such things as treaties and agreements and instruments. Since I'm speaking in London, I'll mention a couple that are especially relevant here. We had an undertaking, comrades, ladies and gentlemen, with the people of what was then Southern Rhodesia. The undertaking took the following form. We will not grant independence to this colony until there's been a majority rule election. It was an undertaking we made to them. We gave them our word, to use an old-fashioned phrase. It was also an undertaking we made to the Decolonization Committee of the United Nations. It was an undertaking further made to Parliament. I'm talking about the period 1963 onwards. In 1965, when it became evident that the reserve strength of reaction in Southern Rhodesia was great enough to license the probability of a military coup, a mutiny in the armed forces of the Crown, a declaration unilaterally of independence, all the things, in fact, that did lead to 20 years of war and waste and shame, the Labour government of Harold Wilson announced in advance that it would not use force to prevent this happening. The option of preemption was thrown away. This was as much as to say, to issue an invitation to those about to announce their own coup and their own aggression. And we're paying for it to this day, as are the people of what is now Zimbabwe. We had a treaty we insisted upon ourselves with the people of Cyprus, written in 1960, guaranteeing a British force in defense of constitutional law and order in Cyprus and to avoid either partition, Taksim as the Turks call it, or enosis as the Greeks call it, unification with Greece. In 1974 it became very evident that a military operation was in the making, directed from Athens to destroy the elected sovereign government of Archbishop Makarios, with whom we had this treaty. It was not found convenient to honor the terms of the treaty. Elaborate excuses were found for saying why this would not be appropriate. The net was spread in the eyes of the bird, however. Everyone could see it coming, and those who let it run have to accept the responsibility for what they did and did not do to preempt what very nearly became a 3- and 4-country war in the Mediterranean and on the southern flank of NATO. Read, if you can, without weeping, the account given by General Romeo Dallaire, a Quebecois officer of some gallantry and experience who had the franchise, I don't mean the franchise at all, I mean the commission to represent the United Nations in Rwanda, in Kigali, in 1991. He received clear intelligence of not just the intention of the genocide, but of the times, places, dates, and hours on which instructions for it and orders for it would be transmitted over the government radio, the meeting points of the militia who would carry it out, and many other horrifying signs that what was long feared was now in train. We have the cables he sent to Kofi Annan's desk. Kofi Annan's been forced to admit he got the faxes and the cables, saying, all we need to do is double our admittedly fairly small force. We have 200 people, I think, in Kigali then. Let's make it 500 and let's make a démarche to the Rwandan authorities. We're beefing up our forces, we're not telling you by how much, and we know what you're doing. What is our condemnation here? What does everyone in this hall have to feel bad about when they read this? Not that we failed in Rwanda, but we did not try. It was not found convenient to attempt a preemption of what we knew was coming, nor a prevention, nor even a prophylaxis, ladies and gentlemen, comrades, not even a prophylaxis of this mass murder. Now, I had no idea we were going to be discussing Iraq this evening until the senator brought it up. But I don't mind fighting on my feet and responding, spontaneously. The motion is about preemption as far as I can see, and I hope I've given you some food for thought on it. But if we must discuss Iraq, then I think we have to say this, or we mustn't discuss it without bearing this in mind. There are 4 conditions under which a state, a sovereign state, can lose or surrender its sovereignty and become, as it were, either the common responsibility of, or in some cases, the common ward, protectorate of the international community or those who act for it. In the case that it invades or tries to occupy a neighbor, in the case that it violates the Genocide Convention that I've mentioned, in the case that it fools around with, I'll put it no higher, the Non-Proliferation Treaty governing weapons of mass destruction that it is thought to be concealing or otherwise fabricating evidence about weapons of mass destruction, and if it is a harborer of international terrorism. The government of Iraq under Saddam Hussein met all these 4 conditions amply, or had done so. It had not just invaded Kuwait, it had abolished the existence of a neighboring Arab Muslim country. It said this is now part of Iraq. It had, as everyone knows, invaded Iran and proposed to do so again. It was for that reason, largely, that it had developed and refused to declare any more its stocks of, or make an honest accounting of its stocks of, horrific weapons of mass destruction. It was, I went to see him there myself, the home base of Abu Nidal, before the emergence of Osama bin Laden, the most wanted man in the world, who was not hiding in Baghdad under government protection, but was an arm of the Ba'ath Party with a villa, a phone number, and a car. It was easy to find him. It wasn't any great journalistic enterprise on my part. And was a regime that was pumping out extraordinary propaganda of jihadism, very rank anti-Semitic propaganda, preachments of violence and terrorism on a daily, hourly, in fact, basis. Let's not say, if you don't want to talk the language of scaring people or fright or moral blackmail, let's not say an imminent threat if you don't want to, if that triggers some horrific response. But anyone who said it wasn't a permanent threat would be fooling themselves. And anyone who thought that it would remain stable would be fooling themselves too. And if you don't preempt yourself, someone is going to preempt you. Iraq wasn't going to remain just like this, bad as it was. It was soon going to become the property of the Uday-Qusay regime. That would have been a great deal of fun to watch from everything I know about those 2 brothers. It could have been an Uday versus Qusay regime as well, before that gave way in turn to a Hobbesian state, a failed state and a rogue state, of all against all, right along the sea lanes of the Gulf, and leading eventually to a triumph of the crudest form of jihadist force. That's what not doing anything about Iraq was inviting. I think that's the case that many of us made for regime change in Iraq, have been making for many years, is not made any worse by George Bush suddenly deciding he agrees with us. I welcome him to our councils. I wouldn't have put it, as the Senator wouldn't either, quite the way he did, but it's better than pretending that Iraq is no problem at all. And I'm beginning to get very tired of those who act as if you can either go and make a mess in Iraq, or you can leave it alone and everything there will presumably, by that standard, be tranquil. Let me say if I'm trespassing on my time. I obviously have a better idea than I thought I did of when I'm de trop. In this category of inescapable, unavoidable confrontations, I don't have time to dilate any further, but it seems to me they would include the Japanese Empire in the Pacific in the 1930s, the attempt to create a greater Serbia out of the ruins of old Yugoslavia, and Iraq, that one has to know and be aware and have enough sense of history, as well as of the present, as well as of international law and custom and practice, to know that when a confrontation is coming, that if you say that you'll take the burden on yourself, so to speak, you're accepting responsibility. You're not becoming the aggressor. The corollary will have to be, if you accept the inevitability of confrontation with aggressive totalitarian regimes, that the time and place of the confrontation will be left to them, and will be left by us to them on purpose. I don't believe there's a single person in this room who really assents to that proposition. So I'll close by saying that a foreign policy must not be merely preemptive, but a foreign policy that doesn't have a preemptive sensibility and capacity is not just going to lead to disaster, but also to defeat. And not only that, but also to disgrace and ultimately to shame. And I invite your opposition to this well-meaning but ill-drafted proposition, ladies and gentlemen. Senator Hart, who I remember very well from my earliest days in Washington, he has, among other things, he's too modest to say it, the distinction of having got Senator Patrick Moynihan of New York to vote for the one and only time that he ever did against a defense appropriation, namely the MX missile. It was, I think I'm correct in saying, on the motion of Senator Hart that this missile was condemned on the grounds that, since it was designed to destroy already hardened and cemented and buried missile bunkers, it presumably would not be launched when those bunkers were already empty.
Thank you to Gary Hart. And now I invite to speak against the motion Christopher Hitchens, who's a writer, broadcaster and columnist. He emigrated to the United States in 1981. For the past 12 years, he's been columnist and contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and has reported, I believe, from something like 60 countries on 5 different continents. His books include studies of the Kurds, the UN, the Palestine question, Clinton, Kissinger, and his most recent...
That would be, as it were, a waste of energy. Preemptive it might have been, but aggressive would also cover it. It was a very dangerous and destabilizing weapon, and I remember that debate and the honourable contribution made by the Senator very vividly. And I remember the way, indeed, in which that the idea, originally very intensely American, well, you get your retaliation in first, helped to degenerate the idea of deterrence and degenerate it further into effectively a policy of use them or lose them. And this was the point at which we had to generate.
A long, short war, the postponed liberation of Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Hitchens.
Thank you, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, can I go as far as brothers and sisters? Good. Comrades and friends? Okay. I apologize for speaking to you through a wad of inflammation from my recent adventures in American dentistry. I don't want to sound more than usually as if I have a plum lodged in my mouth, but I don't want you to mistake my vulnerability for weakness. Many of you will know how terrible it can be to be savaged by a hamster. I also want to say what a distinction it is to appear not just with Comrade Aronovich, with whose father I was at Balliol College when Sam Aronovich, a very celebrated old fighter, was a mature student there, but with Simon Jenkins, who's been lending tone to my profession since I was the merest cub in it, and with